I'm Brian Dixon. We're at Littledown at our name of the farm. At West Ayrton. We're 20 kilometres west of Rangiora and about 40 kilometres northwest of Christchurch. This farm has been in the family's hands for 60 years, since 1952. It has been farmed in various partnerships, but my wife Elizabeth and I we've been running it since 1979. It's 231 hectares. It's 3 soil types, starting from clay and ending up down on stones on the lighter land. At present, the majority of the farm is leased for dairy support. It has been leased for about 8 years now, most of it, and we personally are down only farming 60 acres. Previously we used to run about 2,000 ewes and 500 hoggets. It was originally had stud Corriedales, but haven't had any of them for 10 years. Shelters probably is a major feature in this farm. There's shelter in every paddock, so no matter what the weather brings, we can have stock, and shelter's always available. Tree planting, my father started immediately. Probably it was either 53 or 54, I think the first 3 shelter belts went in. When we came here, the property was in very large paddocks. The paddock we're standing in now was 80 acres, and there was a 65 one over the road and several 40, majority of them are 40, 50 acre paddocks, which have now all been subdivided down to about 4.5, 5 hectares. There was a 1 hectare plantation of radiata, which was about 2 or 3 years old. That was harvested in 1981, and we've just harvested that, reharvested that this summer. I think we got 480 tonnes off that. This block we're in now was planted in 1992, I think, yes, and it's about 2 hectares. It's on quite a steep hill face that never produced a lot of feed at any rate, and it was always more of a nuisance than anything else. And so we decided to plant this as a longer term cash flow, and it has worked out pretty well. It was originally planted at 5 by 2. We've thinned it down to about 400, I think, a hectare. In another 10 years' time, there'll be a good lump sum will come out of this block, which will be very handy for somebody, not necessarily me. With the woodlots, you not only have the advantage of the long-term logs harvest, the entire life they're a big shelter advantage. Up to probably 12, 15 years, you get just as much grazing out of them as you do the rest of the paddock. But after probably 12, 15 years, it's really very limited grazing, but there's still enough in there. If there's a storm at shearing or lambing time, put the sheep in there and they're absolutely fine. We've had several times on occasions over the years where there's been sheep in all the blocks, particularly for that reason. And if it's so warm and cosy, and you can have a really cold driving southerly over that night, and next morning every lamb is live, so they're a massive advantage for the shelter side. So virtually all our shelter on the farm is north-south. So we get good easterly shelter, which is important here as well as the southerly shelter. They are very effective on the southwesterly, as the southwesterly hits them on the side, and there is still a lot of shelter there. So it's very rarely we get a really true major storm that is directly south, generally the southwest. we started going to farm forestry, I think it would be 1980. To us it has become one of our major interests. We've now been to, I think, probably about 25 national conferences and one in Australia. The benefits of belonging is not only comparing what you're doing yourself, but is seeing all the other ideas of farms all over New Zealand. And every conference you go to, or any field days you go to, but wherever you go, there's always some little idea you can pick up of a type of tree, something that somebody's done a wee bit differently. But I think, and then the major thing with the conferences, and that has become probably our major attractions now, is the people we have met, and they are now close personal friends. You only see them once a year, but it's like a homecoming to family when you arrive at the conference, and you meet all these people you haven't seen for 12 months or more. Shelter on this farm, well, I couldn't imagine farming it without it. It's peace of mind is number one, but it is also nice to know if times get tough, there's always those trees that could bring in that extra bit of income. As I said earlier, we're now virtually in a sustainable situation that we could harvest some trees every 2 or 3 years forever now, and I'd like to see it continue. So we do not have irrigation on the place. We still farm it as a dry farm, but even with irrigation it is still quite possible. You might not be able to have the centre pivots, but there's other systems that you can use that are just as not quite simple. They do have a bit more labour, but there are still alternatives to centre pivots. Centre pivots may be the most efficient form of irrigation, but there are alternatives, and if you want to choose between trees and irrigation, there's still a place for those trees. I think one of the most striking examples I've ever heard, we have a friend who had a town supply dairy farm in Ahoka, which is about 10 kilometres from here, and over the winter he housed the cows, and he always said the thing that struck him, the day after the cows went into the shed, their production went up 1 litre per cow, and without changing any feed. One was in to keep them warm and the other one was cold outside. So that to me just gives the benefit of stock, and it's exactly the same on a sheep farm. After shearing, we shear in May, and which has all the advantages of pre-lamb shearing without the disadvantages. But those sheep will still seek shelter right through lambing. Shelter is just part of their life, and without shelter they're lost. So, and it makes a big difference to their production, because the warmth, they need a lot extra feed if they haven't got the shelter. The shelter reduces the feed requirements considerably, and it's like yourself. If you're warm, you're happy too. So happy stock make happy farmers. For a young farmer coming onto this land today, and if it hasn't got much shelter, I think get as much north-south shelter in as possible as soon as possible. And it just completely changes the whole farming operation, your farming profitability, everything. We have a neighbour on the western side who came into a block there with very little shelter. They had a wee bit of east-west shelter, but he has just transformed that farm he hasn't gone to the state of us with every paddock, but every second paddock he's got a row of shelter, and that has just changed that farm within the first 10 years completely to what it used to be very exposed. So it's more important to have some shelter in a paddock than have none. And so get some in as quickly as possible on as many paddocks as possible, and it'll make your life a lot more easier. And woodlots would still have, it's a tricky one on this country because we're in pretty high value land. But I think the woodlots are, you wouldn't do them for the first few years, but once you can afford them and have got the time to maintain them, and I think that's no good planting them without maintaining them, and doing all the silviculture on time and when they're due. If you don't do that, well, you're better probably not having them. But for the first few years, get your shelter on and then start thinking about those places. Well, I think I could have, it'd be nice to have a woodlot in there, and perhaps you might be able to put another one in every 3 or 4 or 5 years. And so over time, if you're there and still there in 30 years' time, there's an income as you get near retirement, as we've got to make some pretty big decisions in the next year or two. What's going to happen to this place? But it is nice to get that money, to know that money will be there as a substantial block, which could help succession or you moving off the farm or whatever. So get the planning in, even if and then get the trees in when you can afford it and when you can see you can have the time to look after them.